Most people assume that if a hacker gets caught, they automatically go to prison for a long time. That is actually one of the biggest misunderstandings I run into. In my opinion, this myth is dangerous because it makes regular people feel more protected than they really are. Today, I am not going to give you the usual hackers go to jail summary. I want to walk you through what the law actually says in 4 different countries and why the reality is a lot messier than people think. Here is what this video will not do. It will not walk you through how any attack is actually carried out, and it will not glamorize cybercrime in any way. What it will do is give you an honest, grounded look at what the legal system can and cannot actually accomplish once an attack has already happened, so you understand exactly where the law protects you and where the real responsibility for staying safe still falls on you. I think a lot of cybersecurity content either scares people into paranoia or reassures them with false confidence, and neither one is honest. My goal today is somewhere in the middle. I want you to walk away from this video with a realistic picture, not a dramatic one. We are going to go country by country, and along the way, I will point out patterns that repeat across all 4, because those patterns tell you far more about how the system actually works than any single law on its own ever could. Welcome to Cyber Safety Brief, where we explain simple cybersecurity advice for everyday Americans. If you are new here, this channel is about breaking down confusing cyber topics into something you can actually use in real life. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something. This video is based on authentic, legal, and publicly available cybersecurity information. Everything here is for awareness and protection only. We are not going to talk about how to hack anyone. We are talking about what happens legally after a hack occurs, so you understand your rights and the risks involved. Point 1. The United States. Let us start close to home, with the United States. What most people underestimate is how broad American cybercrime law actually is. The main law here is called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It was originally written decades ago, long before smartphones, cloud storage, or remote work existed. Over the years, it has been stretched and reinterpreted to cover almost any unauthorized access to a computer system, whether that is a massive corporate breach or something as small as logging into an account you were not supposed to touch. Here is a real-life type of example. Imagine an employee who leaves a company but still remembers the password to an old shared account. If they log in out of curiosity, even without stealing anything, that action can technically fall under this law. In my opinion, this is where a lot of people get surprised. They think the law only applies to real hackers in hoodies typing green code on a black screen. It does not work like that. The law is about unauthorized access, not about how skilled you are. Now, when someone commits a serious cyber attack in the United States, especially something involving financial theft, ransomware, or attacks on critical infrastructure, the penalties can be severe. We are talking about federal charges, meaning the case is handled at a national level, not just a local one. Sentences can include years in federal prison, heavy fines, and a permanent criminal record that follows someone for the rest of their life. But here is the twist most videos will not tell you. A large number of cyber attacks against Americans are carried out by people who are not physically in the United States at all, and that changes everything. Safe steps you can take. If you are ever the victim of a cyber attack, report it to your local authorities and to national cybercrime reporting centers. Documentation matters. Screenshots, timestamps, and saved emails can make a real difference in whether a case can even be pursued. What I personally think people misunderstand most about U.S. cybercrime enforcement is the sheer scale of what investigators are dealing with. Federal agencies handle an enormous volume of reported incidents every single year, and not every case receives the same level of attention. Smaller-scale attacks against individuals, while devastating to the person affected, often do not get the same investigative resources as attacks against major corporations, hospitals, or government systems. This is not because individual victims do not matter. It is simply a reflection of limited resources being directed toward the cases with the widest potential impact. Here is another layer most people do not think about. Civil lawsuits exist alongside criminal charges in the U.S. system. Even when a criminal case is difficult to pursue, victims sometimes have the option to pursue civil action, particularly against organizations that failed to protect their data through negligence. In my opinion, this dual-track system is one of the more powerful, if underused, tools available to American consumers and small businesses who have been harmed by a breach. There is one more layer to the U.S. system that I think gets overlooked, and that is the difference between state and federal jurisdiction. Not every cyber offense automatically becomes a federal case. Many smaller incidents are handled at the state level, and every state has its own specific laws covering things like identity theft, computer trespass, and online harassment. In my opinion, this creates a patchwork that can be confusing even for victims trying to figure out where to report an incident in the first place. What I personally think would help most people is simply knowing that you do not need to figure out the exact jurisdiction yourself. National reporting centers exist specifically to route your report to the correct agency, so your job as a victim is just to report clearly and thoroughly, not to become an expert in jurisdictional law. Point 2. The United Kingdom. Let us move across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom. The UK has its own version of a cybercrime law, and it has been around even longer than the American one. It focuses on unauthorized access to computer systems and unauthorized modification of data. The way I look at it, the UK law is actually a bit more straightforward in its wording, but enforcement is where things get complicated. Here is something that surprises a lot of people. The UK has one of the more active cybercrime enforcement agencies in the world, working closely with law enforcement to track down attackers. But even with strong enforcement, the conviction rate for cybercrime cases remains lower than most people expect. Why? Because digital evidence is complicated, attackers often use multiple layers of disguise online, and many attacks originate from outside the country entirely. A real-life type of example: a small UK business gets hit by a ransomware attack. The business reports it. Investigators trace some of the digital trail, but the attacker used servers routed through several different countries, making it extremely difficult to identify a real person, let alone arrest them. In my opinion, this is the uncomfortable truth that most cybersecurity content ignores. Reporting a crime is important and it is still the right thing to do, but it does not guarantee justice the way people assume. When someone is convicted under UK cybercrime law, penalties can include prison time, especially for attacks that cause serious damage or target essential services. But what I personally think people should focus on is prevention, not just punishment after the fact, because punishment does not undo the damage that was already done. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this. Do you think the punishment side of cybercrime gets too much attention compared to prevention? There is another dimension to the UK approach that I think deserves attention, and that is the growing focus on holding organizations accountable, not just individual attackers. If a UK company fails to implement reasonable security measures and that failure contributes to a breach, the company itself can face significant regulatory penalties separate from whatever happens to the attacker. In my opinion, this shifts a meaningful amount of responsibility back onto the businesses people trust with their data, rather than placing the entire burden of justice on catching a possibly untraceable attacker. What I personally think makes the UK system worth paying attention to is this combined approach of criminal law and regulatory accountability working side by side. It does not solve the extradition and cross-border enforcement problem, but it does mean that even when an attacker cannot be identified, there can still be meaningful consequences somewhere in the chain of responsibility, particularly for organizations that were careless with the personal information entrusted to them. Point 3. Canada. Now let us talk about Canada, because this is where things get interesting. Canada's approach to cybercrime is built into its broader criminal code, rather than having one single standalone hacking law like some other countries. This means unauthorized computer use, data theft, and related offenses are prosecuted under sections that cover a wide range of digital crimes. What most people underestimate about Canada is how seriously identity theft and data breaches are treated here, especially when it comes to protecting personal information. Canada has strong privacy legislation that works alongside criminal law, so a cyber attack is not just a criminal matter. It can also trigger separate legal consequences related to privacy violations. Here is a real-life type of scenario. A Canadian company suffers a data breach that exposes customer information. Beyond any criminal investigation into the attacker, the company itself may face scrutiny over whether it properly protected that data in the first place. In my opinion, this dual approach is actually smart. It does not just punish the attacker, it also holds organizations accountable for how they protect people in the first place. Sentencing for serious cyber offenses in Canada can include significant prison time, particularly when the attack involves financial fraud or targets critical systems like healthcare or utilities. But similar to the other countries we have covered, the biggest challenge is not the law itself. It is identifying who actually committed the crime when attacks are routed through multiple countries and hidden behind layers of anonymization. What I personally think stands out about Canada is how the country balances individual accountability with organizational responsibility. Much like the UK, Canadian privacy regulators can investigate whether an organization took reasonable steps to protect personal information, independent of whether the attacker who exploited that weakness is ever caught. In my opinion, this two-track accountability system is quietly becoming the global standard, and it makes sense. If you cannot always guarantee justice against an attacker, you can at least push organizations to take prevention seriously, since that is something within their direct control. A real-life type of pattern that plays out across Canada involves smaller businesses that assume they are too small to be targeted. This assumption tends to be wrong. Smaller organizations are often targeted precisely because they typically have fewer resources dedicated to cybersecurity, making them easier entry points compared to larger, better-defended organizations. I also want to mention something about Canada's approach to cross-border data that I think is genuinely interesting. Because so much Canadian internet traffic and cloud storage passes through infrastructure located in other countries, Canadian privacy regulators have had to build relationships and processes for cooperating with agencies abroad just to properly investigate cases involving Canadian victims. In my opinion, this reflects a broader reality that applies to every country we are discussing today. Cybercrime rarely respects national borders, and the effectiveness of any single country's laws is only ever as strong as its ability to cooperate internationally when a case requires it. Point 4. Australia. Let us head down to Australia now, and this is where I want to challenge another common assumption. Australia has cybercrime legislation that covers unauthorized access, data interference, and denial of service-style attacks. What makes Australia interesting is the country's more recent focus on protecting critical infrastructure, meaning things like power grids, water systems, and healthcare networks. The way I look at it, Australia learned some hard lessons after a series of high-profile breaches affecting large organizations in recent years. This pushed lawmakers to take a more aggressive stance on penalties, particularly for attacks that put critical services or large amounts of personal data at risk. A real-life type of example. An attack targets a healthcare provider and exposes sensitive medical records for a large number of people. Under Australian law, this kind of breach can trigger both criminal prosecution of the attacker, if they are identified, and separate consequences for the organization if it failed to meet data protection obligations. What I personally think is important here is that Australia's laws show a trend that is happening across all 4 of these countries. Governments are no longer treating cybersecurity as just a technical issue. It is becoming a legal and regulatory issue that touches businesses, healthcare providers, schools, and everyday individuals. The way I look at it, Australia's approach to critical infrastructure protection is one of the more forward-thinking examples among these 4 countries. Rather than waiting for individual companies to voluntarily improve their defenses, Australian regulation has moved toward requiring certain sectors, particularly those tied to essential services, to meet specific security obligations or face real consequences. In my opinion, this proactive stance is a direct response to lessons learned the hard way, and it reflects a broader shift where governments are no longer content to only punish attackers after the fact. They are increasingly focused on forcing better prevention before an attack ever happens. Point 5. The uncomfortable truth about international hackers. Now here is the part of this video that I think matters the most, and it is the part most cybersecurity content skips over. A huge percentage of cyber attacks against people and businesses in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia are carried out by individuals who are physically located in countries with little to no cooperation on cybercrime extradition. This means that even when investigators know exactly who committed an attack, actually arresting and prosecuting that person can be nearly impossible. In my opinion, this is the single biggest gap between what people assume cybercrime law does and what it actually accomplishes in practice. The laws we just talked about are real, they are enforced, and they do lead to serious consequences for people caught within reach of these justice systems. But for a large portion of global cybercrime, the honest answer is that many attackers are never arrested at all. I do not think this is about being paranoid. I think it is about being prepared. Understanding this reality is not meant to scare you. It is meant to shift your focus toward prevention, because relying on the law to punish an attacker after the fact should never be your only line of defense. Safe, defensive steps that actually help. Keep your software updated. Use unique passwords for different accounts, enable multi-factor authentication where it is available, and back up important data regularly so that even if something goes wrong, you are not starting from zero. What I personally think is worth adding here is that international cooperation between these 4 countries specifically is actually stronger than most people assume. The US, UK, Canada, and Australia, along with New Zealand, share intelligence and cooperate closely on serious cybercrime cases through long-standing alliances. When an attack is large enough, serious enough, or tied to broader national security concerns, this cooperation can and does lead to real arrests, even across borders. The gap I am describing tends to apply most to smaller-scale opportunistic cybercrime, not the largest and most damaging attacks, which do tend to draw significant coordinated attention. Point 6. What this means for you as an individual. So, what does all of this actually mean for you, sitting at home or running a small business? What I personally think is that knowing these laws exist should give you a certain level of confidence, but not false confidence. If you are ever targeted by a cyber attack, reporting it matters, and it can absolutely lead to real consequences for the attacker, especially if they are located within one of these 4 countries. But the process can be slow, and it is not guaranteed. This is why the smartest approach, in my opinion, is layered protection. Legal consequences are one layer. Good personal cybersecurity habits are another layer. And staying informed, which is exactly what you are doing right now by watching this video, is a third layer. If you run a small business, I think this point matters even more than it does for an individual. A single serious cyber attack can be devastating for a small business, not just financially, but in terms of customer trust. In my opinion, small business owners should treat cybersecurity the same way they treat insurance or basic safety compliance, as a fundamental cost of doing business rather than an optional extra. The legal consequences an attacker might eventually face will rarely arrive in time to undo the damage already done to your reputation or your finances, which is exactly why prevention has to come first. I would also like to know your opinion. Do you think cybercrime laws are strong enough today, or do you think they are struggling to keep up with how fast technology is changing? Point 7. Why ransomware is changing how these laws are enforced. I want to spend a moment on ransomware specifically, because in my opinion, it has done more to reshape cybercrime law in all 4 of these countries than almost any other type of attack. What most people underestimate is how ransomware attacks blur the line between a purely criminal matter and a national security concern. When ransomware hits a hospital, a school district, or a piece of critical infrastructure like a utility provider, the consequences extend far beyond financial loss. Lives can genuinely be put at risk when essential systems go down. This is exactly why lawmakers in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia have all moved toward treating ransomware attacks on critical services as a much more serious category of crime compared to a typical data breach. Here is a real-life type of scenario. A ransomware attack shuts down a hospital's computer systems, forcing staff to revert to paper records and delaying certain procedures. Even if no one is physically harmed, the disruption alone is treated as a serious offense under the law, often carrying harsher penalties than a comparable attack against a company that simply loses some data. In my opinion, this distinction makes sense. The law is increasingly recognizing that not all cyber attacks carry equal real-world weight, and sentencing reflects that. What I personally think is one of the more controversial debates happening right now across all 4 of these countries is whether paying a ransom should ever be legal in the first place. Some argue that paying simply funds future attacks and should be discouraged or restricted. Others argue that for an organization facing a life-or-death situation, like a hospital unable to access patient records, refusing to pay is not always realistic. I do not think there is an easy answer here, and honestly, I think this is one of the more important ongoing conversations in cybersecurity policy today. Point 8. What actually happens when you report an attack? Let me walk you through what the reporting process actually looks like in practice, because I think this is the part that discourages people the most when they do not understand it. In my opinion, the biggest mistake people make is expecting an immediate response. When you report a cyber attack, whether it is identity theft, a scam, or unauthorized account access, you are usually filing a report that gets added to a much larger database. Investigators use these reports to identify patterns, connect related cases, and prioritize resources toward the most damaging or widespread threats. A single isolated report might not trigger an immediate investigation on its own, but it can become a crucial piece of a larger case if enough similar reports point toward the same attacker or the same method. What I personally think people should understand is that reporting still matters enormously, even when it does not lead to a quick resolution for you individually. Here is a real-life type of example. A wave of similar scam messages targets people across several cities. Individually, each report might seem minor. Collectively, those reports can help investigators identify a pattern, trace shared infrastructure, and eventually build a case strong enough to act on. Your report might be the piece that completes that picture, even if you never personally hear about the outcome. The way I look at it, there is also real value in reporting, even when you already suspect nothing will come of your specific case. Beyond feeding into larger investigations, reports create an official record that can matter later, whether for insurance claims, disputing fraudulent charges with your bank, or simply protecting yourself if the same attacker resurfaces and targets you again. I do not think this is about being paranoid. I think it is about being prepared, and having that paper trail in place before you need it is far better than trying to reconstruct one after the fact. If this video helps you understand online safety more clearly, like the video and subscribe to Cyber Safety Brief for more simple cybersecurity advice. Stay alert, stay informed, and stay safe online. Understanding these laws is not about giving up on justice, and it is not about assuming the system will always fail you. It is about having a realistic picture so you can make smarter decisions about how you protect yourself, your family, and your business every single day. Before you go, comment below which country's approach to cybercrime you think is getting it the most right.